Thank you for joining Jackson Lewis as we take a closer look at the employment law trends and tactics sure to shape 2023. This installment is one of 12 concise, field-specific podcast episodes that are part of our annual forecasting favorite, The Year Ahead. We invite you and others at your organization to experience the report's legislative, regulatory, and litigation insights in full at our website, jacksonlewis.com, or listen to the podcast series at whichever platform you turn to for compelling content.
Hello and welcome to the Year Ahead podcast. Today, John Spitz, who is the co-chair of our National Labor Practice, and I, Rick Vitarelli, who is the other co-chair. We're going to talk about some things that we've been seeing in the industry, as well as some developments at the National Labor Relations Board and some trends that might be interesting to employers as we get deeper into 2023. Starting it off, using the old adage, past is prologue. We're expected to see more of what we saw in 2022 in 2023. The biggest news in 2022 was that organizing and strikes were significantly up in terms of the industry. In 2022, we saw an uptick in both types of activity. Organizing increased to over 2,500 petitions with almost 1,680 elections held. That was a high going back many years, and it was pretty significant this year. We did see a lot of organizing in some sectors, including quick serve restaurants and coffee shops. In 2022, we also saw an increase in strikes. So there were 358 strikes in 2022, which is well above the 257 from 2021 and well above even what we saw pre-COVID. In 2019, by way of example, there were 165 strikes. What seems to be spurring both the organizing activity and strike activity are major sort of macroeconomic factors that have impacted the workplace. Pay continues to be a major factor today, with inflation up in highest numbers than we've seen in over 50 years. There is a major outcry for employers to pay more money for employees. If you couple inflation, the fact that consumer goods and the cost of living are increasing, with the fact that there is an overall shortage in many, many industries for qualified and skilled workers, add those two together, it creates a dynamic where unions and employees can demand higher pay and go out in the street and withhold services to try to pressure employers to pay more. That seems to be the biggest issue that we've seen. We've seen organizing rally around pay. Certain industries where we've seen a particular amount of activity have included trucking, transportation, which includes warehousing, healthcare, construction, retail, among others. Other issues that are prompting organizing activity and strikes have been staffing and scheduling. Again, where you've got a very tight labor market where it's difficult to hire and retain workers, it's becoming more difficult for those workers who are currently in the workplace to have predictable schedules and to be able to have the benefits of an appropriately staffed workplace. In many cases, staffing is not the employer's fault. It's not the fault of the employer not paying enough. It's just a symptom of there not being enough workers in the market to be able to hire folks. Health and safety continues to be a major issue and a rallying point, again, around strikes. I think if you look at the stats, pay, staffing, scheduling, health and safety, and even COVID effects continue to be drivers of organizing and strike activity. We've seen in 2022 a great deal of success in what we call caffeinated organizing involving coffee shops and quick service restaurants. We've also seen major e-commerce vendors get organized. Really, for us to be able to assess whether or not those activities are going to have any permanency will depend upon whether or not first contracts are gained. At this point, we've seen some major organizing efforts against individual employers take off like wildfire, only to be sort of held up as first contracts are being negotiated. And so now that folks are in collective bargaining and the workers who've organized unions are starting to see what that process looks like, we have not seen a lot of settlements so far in contract negotiations, and it will be interesting to see if the level of organizing in some of these businesses will continue in 2023. One of the biggest things that we've seen this year, and one that gets the most press, is that the National Labor Relations Board has really given a major assist to organized labor. There have been changes in rulemaking, in decisions by the board overturning precedent. John has been extremely active in 2022 as a trial lawyer in NLRB cases across the country and in handling NLRB enforcement. So, John, I think it's going to be important to hear from you as to what you're seeing from the NLRB and what impact it has on their labor relations.
Thanks, Rick, and good morning or afternoon, as the case may be, everyone. Well, it all starts with the General Counsel, Rick. The General Counsel of the Labor Board decides what cases to prosecute and the theories under which to prosecute those cases. The proclivities, of course, of the general counsel are determined by the president. The president appoints the general counsel, and the president also appoints the members of the labor board. And when there's a Democratic president in the office, as there is now, you're going to have a labor-leaning general counsel and a 3-2 Democratic or labor-leaning majority at the labor board. So the current general counsel is Jennifer Abruzzo. She is a former union side lawyer, and she has been extremely aggressive in pursuing theories, changes to precedent, and aggressive enforcement to help foster unionization and to protect employee rights, not just in union workplaces, but also in non-union workplaces. And so, she sets the tone because she's got to bring the cases for the labor board to adjudicate. So, she is pursuing a number of theories that will greatly help organize labor. For example, when a union tries to organize an employer, historically, the union will make a demand for recognition and may represent that the union has a majority signed up and that an election is unnecessary. That's called a demand for recognition. Historically, an employer has the right to decline a union's demand for recognition and force an election, a secret ballot election governed by the labor board. And in a case named Joyce Silk Mills, a 1949 case, the labor board said that an employer has the right to decline recognition. Jennifer Abruzzo is trying to go back to precedent which would require an employer to have a good faith doubt of a union's majority status before it could force an election and decline a demand for recognition. So that's one example of where the general counsel is trying to tip the scales a little bit. Another example is that for the entire history of the National Labor Relations Act, it has been lawful for employers to have captive audience meetings. Well, in April of 2022, the general counsel issued a memorandum in which she announced that she's going to take the position that captive audience meetings and other mandatory meetings in which the employer discusses unionization are coercive and violate the act. She's taking steps to limit the possibility of electronic surveillance. She issued a memorandum recently in which she said that electronic monitoring, which could reasonably be construed or could be used to interfere with employee rights, should be held to violate the act. For example, GPS tracking that could be used to track union adherence throughout an employer's facility. That's personally, I see that as a tremendous overreach. Virtually any device could be used to track union activity. For example, employers could read employee emails if it's got reason to suspect, unlawful harassment, et cetera. Well, you could also do that to track union activity. So, that to me is a great overreach. The fact is, it's unlawful to interfere with employee rights. It's unlawful to surveil union activity. The law has dealt with that for decades, and we could do that in the electronic context. Another example is GC Memo 22-06 from June of 2022, in which the general counsel argued that the board should be more aggressive in pursuing consequential damages when an employee is unlawfully discharged. For example, monetizing an impact on an employee's credit score because he or she lost their job and didn't pay their bills, or helping an employee or requiring an employer to reimburse an employee to buy a new car because their car was repossessed after being discharged. And these are examples used in the memo. In a case called Thrive, the labor board adapted General Counsel Abruzzo's recommendations to be more aggressive in recovering consequential damages for alleged violations of the act. So, it starts with the general counsel theory. They bring the theory in a complaint, they litigate the theory, and then they need the board to rule for them, which the board is increasingly doing. The board also has the ability to issue rulemaking. The board has issued rulemaking in which it's going to overturn the Browning-Ferris Industries decision with respect to joint employer status and make it easier to find that two employers are joint employers of the same group of employees. Previously, an employer had to exert direct and immediate control over the employees in order for them to be found to be joint employers. Under the standard that the board is proposing in its rulemaking, that even indirect control over employees will result in joint employer status. For example, the ability of an employer to remove temporary employees from their work site could be enough. So, that is a significant step. Their rulemaking continues to be significant. Employers have talked a lot about micro units over past years. It's easier for unions to organize smaller groups of employees. The standard has gone back and forth as to whether a union could easily chip off a small group of employees and what kind of community of interest that group could share with the larger group before they can chip off the smaller group. In American Steel, the board made it much easier for a union to try to organize smaller groups and establish beachheads in larger workplaces. Another important case was the Bexar County Performing Arts Center, in which the board made it easier for unions to access workplaces where they have employees who are employed as contractors. So, we're seeing the rulings. I think we're going to keep seeing the rulings in 2023. It's been fascinating to watch over the last couple of years. So that's the labor board piece, right? The general counsel has tremendous ability to bring new cases, to more aggressively enforce different aspects of the act, and the board has the ability, of course, to reverse its precedents and change the playing field to make it easier for unions to organize and bargain. But that's not the only governmental entity that has been active during the Biden administration. Rick, what are you seeing in your practice?
Well, so what we're seeing at the state and local level has been pretty interesting. This is nothing new. We've seen this trend beginning even before the Biden administration, especially in progressive states and in municipalities, governmental subdivisions, whether it's state or local governments, have done this. But we're seeing that, especially in the case of new industries like energy, solar, clean energy industries, as well as in cannabis, for example, where we've seen a lot of growth and a lot of state and local regulation permitting the sale of recreational cannabis. We've seen a lot of earmarks in either legislation or in government contracts that require an employer that wants to get into those industries or wants to take advantage of incentives or tax breaks to give the unions a leg up, either through entering into neutrality agreements as a condition of getting the concession or being approved to either develop or operate in these areas, or if they're going to construct or build out facilities, to enter into project labor agreements with the construction trades. And this seems to be a trend that is happening across the country. Even at the federal level in the Inflation Reduction Act, there are earmarks and requirements in that legislation for prevailing wage payment and in order to be able to take advantage of major tax breaks. So companies that are investing in these new energy areas are basically looking to go union because there are advantages under the legislation. We expect to see more and more of that. Obviously, the limitation on local governments to require, especially in the case of non-construction development, like neutrality agreements and labor peace agreements that don't apply in construction. There are some limitations because of federal preemption, but it's been an interesting development to see how there's so much legislation, regulation, and contract requirements in the public sector that would require private actors and private employers to make it easier for unions to organize. So that's something that we're seeing a lot of. Again, it's not necessarily upon the federal government, but it seems to be a trend.
Yeah, I think we're going to continue to see the Biden administration reverberate, and it's been fascinating, and it's also been fascinating tying into some of the larger union trends and regulation of the workplace generally.
John and I like to think we can look into the future, but we think that we have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen in 23. We wish all of you and your families and loved ones the best of health and happiness in 2023.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the Year Ahead 2023 Special Edition podcast series. Please tune in to the next episode, where we will continue to tell you not only what's legal, but what is effective? All of our Jackson Lewis podcasts are available to stream and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Libsyn, Pandora, SoundCloud, Spotify, Stitcher, and YouTube. For more information on today's topic, our presenters, and other Jackson Lewis resources, visit jacksonlewis.com. As a reminder, this material is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to constitute legal advice, nor does it create a client-lawyer relationship between Jackson Lewis and any recipient.